What's happening, guys? Here we are with our TSL men's development presentation. And this one is everything that you know about porn and masturbation is wrong. Now, it's kind of a bold statement, so perhaps if you are on our wavelength, it isn't wrong. But this is going to kind of go against the grain of a lot of the different things that you thought, but also get into a solution of how we've worked with guys who have had major problems with porn, with masturbation, with sex addiction. Those are all kind of different things that shouldn't be lumped together in one. So we're going to dissect that now, and it's going to get good. So first thing first here, guys, is this is not the norm. You know, there's a lot of TED Talks, there's a lot of articles on porn, on masturbation, on sex addiction, all these different things. We're going to take a very different look at this. Okay, we're going to take a very different take on it. And most likely this is going to be very different from what you've heard. But that being said, let me tell you a little bit about my background. Number one, I'm not a scientist, okay? And that being said, you know, I've never done academic research or work or, you know, those types of things on this. However, at the same time, let me just tell you, most of the people who do those articles, who give the talks, I'm going to actually argue that they're not really qualified to be talking about this themselves. Now, number one, you know, for the last 10 years, I've worked exclusively with men. That's all I've done on all sorts of different stuff. This is a huge topic, and the whole 10 years, this has been a major topic: porn, masturbation, sex addiction. And I've also worked with people on chemical addiction. So that means chemical dependency, drug and alcohol, substance abuse, and all that sort of stuff. That also being said, I myself am what I would consider a sex addict. And we'll get into the differences between just a guy that's a little bit confused about, you know, some sexual issues and true sex addiction. I'm also a drug addict. I'm in recovery of all those things. I've also found really healthy ways to live in terms of love, sex, relationships, and in terms of, you know, being free of drug and alcohol dependency, at least for now, at least for today. But that all being said, the sad part about a lot of the information that we hear about this is it doesn't take into account some of the problems that people who really have these problems, like real sex addiction or real drug addiction, and the differences of drug addiction and sex addiction into account when they're breaking down a lot of this material. And sadly, a lot of this material sounds good, it's great, but as we're going to point out here, it follows the same hysteria, like bullet tagline stuff that has always been associated with sex, always been associated with masturbation, and also you know, we don't discuss it too much here in the breakdown of this webinar, but that's been associated with a lot of the drug hysteria and the different epidemics that come into play with that. So that being said, why am I sharing all this, right? Okay, so first off, it's for a few reasons. Number one, the first thing is that, you know, most of the information about porn, about sex, about addiction is misinterpreted or it's incomplete. Okay. Now, a lot of it could be right to a certain degree, and we're not really arguing that. You know, you can't really argue with certain sorts of stats, but the interpretation of those and the ways that it runs with it are just, they get all screwed up, you know, and it's talked about and explained as science. You know, it's touted in these ways, but the reason why it can't be science is because it's not true. You know, it just the way that it works out, the way that these things play out, whether it's the solution or the problem, are not really articulated well by these people, and it's not actually what happens. Again, this is where we have a tremendous amount of experience on this. Okay, the second thing is if somebody really is a sex addict, if somebody really has that, like that compulsive, obsessive behavior, you know, towards sex, getting sex, using sex, making it a part of their life, you get into some pretty crazy spots that if you take the advice of what you hear on a lot of these TED Talks, and we'll get into the specifics of those, but like the withholding and the boundaries around sex and the, you know, no masturbation or sexual contact for 90 days, you know, don't watch porn or whatever. If you do those things and you only do it the way that they explain it, you will end up worse. And that is something that I've seen over and over again. It's really screwed up. It's actually terrible. I hate it. That is really the main reason why I'm doing this, because so many of my friends who go on that route, whether they work with an inexperienced sexual therapist or they kind of like tutor themselves with watching stuff online, they just dig themselves deeper in a hole, and you don't have to. It's really kind of messed up. The third is this is not a porn and sex addiction problem, but it's actually a cultural problem that we have with sex. Now, that's super important. Okay, so, you know, and let's not jump to extremes here. This always happens when you bring it up. It's like, it's like, well, wait a minute, you're saying porn is good and da da da. Well, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's the only problem. If you have a problem with sex and porn and using your time in those ways, or sexual dysfunctions and so on as a result of your sexual behaviors, porn is not the problem. It's you, and it's how you view sex, which does come from our culture. And that is really the thing that we need to fix. And man, if we are focusing and blaming like one thing, or maybe a few, hot topic, like tagline things, we're really missing the point of it all. It's really a bummer. Okay. Now, that being said, guys, this is going to be long. This is a long presentation, and we really cover a lot of things in it. So I'm going to apologize in advance. If you do just want to kind of cut to the chase on this, there's an article that breaks all this down that this presentation is based off of. Okay, you can find that, and you can also listen to a shorter version of an audio breakdown of this at thesexuallife.com/porn. So there you can get an article, you can get the podcast, you can find different ways to interact with what we broadcast here at TSL and at our different groups like Austin Men's Development and so on. And how to interact with the solution that we're talking about here. I'm also going to say that this webinar is purely information. I mean, obviously, I have a business, I've run a business, but one thing that I really want to say, and this is an interesting thing when you look at a lot of the propaganda that comes out about drug addiction, is that there's so much that is linked to big business, to self-profit, to all these different things that kind of pollute the message. Now, don't get me wrong, I have a business. That may, kind of skew the way things go, but all the addiction work that I do has always been for free. It's always been volunteer based, and man, it's really good stuff. So if you want to plug in to some of those free groups, if you want to look at some of the more specific courses that we have that are paid, you can find that all at thesexuallife.com/porn, and also listen to the podcast and article and so on, and plug into some good stuff, man. If you're having a problem with this, there's truly a solution there. Sit down, listen to it, interact with it, be open-minded towards it, and commit to it if you like what you hear, because it's some good stuff. All right, so the things that we're going to cover here is we're going to cover masturbation. We're going to cover porn. We're going to cover sexual dysfunction, what starts it and the different variants of it, and then also what maintains it. This is stuff that isn't talked about. Okay, we're going to talk about who actually uses porn. We're actually going to talk about who gets sexual dysfunction as well. So how that actually manifests in the different types of people and kind of personality types or situations that people walk into that develop it. We're also going to talk about the proposed solution, and then we're going to talk about what really works. Okay, so that's why this is going to be so long and so jam-packed. So bottom line here, guys, I have had a men's development business for 10 years. We've focused on dating, and sex is a huge part of that. You're always going to when you're working with guys. In one of the common questions, or the common questions that come up, or common topics that come up just almost incessantly. I say that kind of as a bad thing, but it's not. I mean, it's good. We should be talking about this. There's such a demand to really talk about these things. There are things like sexual performance anxiety, premature ejaculation, sexual dysfunction in terms of not being able to get it up, not being able to maintain an erection, how to last longer, the no FAP movement, which is like the no masturbation movement, how to control your masturbation, how to control your porn use or overcome these problems. These are things that are always being talked about in different groups of men, and they're massive, and there's so much misinformation on it. And really, for it to be like credible information, it's got to have experience with guys getting better at this. I see so much exchange, and this is with all things, and we were actually just talking about this before the call, but fitness, another big topic for men. It's always going to be health and fitness, diet, nutrition, all those different things. Fighting, martial arts, that's a big one. Obviously dating and sex, purpose and career, how to develop your lifestyle. There's so much information on these, but if you do not have a group or a solid track record of people getting results and becoming happy with this, it's useless. It's information that isn't tested. It's information that sounds good, and it's information that's kind of sold, and basically it's propaganda and not really something that's going to help you. So let's get into the stuff that will help you. So first off, There's the nature of sex. So the Sexual Life is a company that I founded way back when, and now it's become a group and a community that is a bunch of people and a bunch of guys who are actually live on this webinar with me. And man, just it's a mind of its own. But one of the things that holds us together is we want to get into the nature. What is the natural expression of our body, our minds, and connection? And when we get into connection, there's our social connection, there's our sexual connection. So one of the greatest things that we have is a sexual expression. It's beautiful. It's awesome. It's what we are born to do. But what's interesting is for millennia, so for thousands of years, culture has tried to regulate that, suppress it. And anything that has to do with sex, sexual behavior, sexual relationships, culture tries to control that and reshape it. So much to the point where it can totally cut it out, where it can enforce it in different ways. And one thing that has been true is that sex always wins. So even with the consequence of eternal hell that you and your being, so if your culture propagates this, which there have been many cultures that have and still do, that if you have sex in ways that are, not right according to that culture, you will be screwed for eternity. Not just this life, but every life. Guess what happens? People still have sex in those ways. So what we have to look at actually is, how are people having sex? What are the real realities of how people have sex? And then what are these cultural, kind of reactions to people having sex? And what are these rebellions? But what's the true nature of sex? And we want to get into that. Okay. Masturbation is part of the nature of sex. No matter how much we try and control it, no matter how much culture says it's right or wrong or how we should do it, man, it's gonna fucking happen. It is going to happen. And think about these things. It's the same old story about, whatever culture you're in, or, household, or maybe, religion that you're a part of. There's a regulation towards masturbation, much like, all things sexual or all things bad. If you do it, you're going to go blind. You're going to get hairy palms. You're going to go to hell. You're screwed forever. You'll lose your masculinity. And let's look at some of these more modern day ones. If you masturbate, you're going to release too much energy. You're going to lose testosterone. You're going to develop bad habits. One of the things that was actually said in the 70s or 80s is that you'll develop like a psychotic behavior. Guess what? That was also said in the 30s. That was also said in the 40s. But how is that being said now? You're going to develop qualities where your synapses aren't firing right, or your neural pathways are screwed up, or whatever it is. But you're going to develop a psychological disorder due to masturbation. And here's these CAT scans and MRIs to prove it. But again, it's not looking at the overall complex thing. And one thing that I always talk about on other calls, and if you're a part of our member site, you can access a lot of this information, is that, our neural pathways, our brain, and that's a theory in itself, but how our brain works and communicates different forms of communication and interaction and reading people was not meant for this much stimuli in any form. All right. So things like empathy, things like connection, things like rapport, things like making friends are all a distortion from what we've had. And we're really in overload with that and have a lot of social dysfunctions because of it. So again, we got to look at the nature of it. What's the nature of being social? And hey, you can watch my Myth of the Alpha Male speech at the 21 convention if you want to find out more about that. So either way, we're still running into all these big, warnings about masturbation. Okay. And here we get into another slide about masturbation. It's one of the most normal things you can do. In fact, this is one thing that we talk about heavily at what we do here in our TSL communities and our men's development communities, is that in order for you to have a good sex life, in order for you to be sexually healthy in your mind, in your body, in your overall expression, your ability to have relationships, masturbation is included in that. You've got to be able to do it. Okay. And when you masturbate, this is what happens. You have different thoughts. When you are sexually activated, whether that's through yourself, through masturbation, or you're with somebody else, you're going to think differently. You're going to get a hyper focus on sex. You're going to, even compulsively seek it to a certain degree. You're going to perhaps think dirtier thoughts or bad thoughts, things that you would never think about. And the interesting thing is, when you're in an environment that doesn't talk about sex, where, we kind of repress the sexual message, then guess what? That's a good way to build secrets. That's a good way to build isolation. That's a good way to create shame. And when you have isolation alone, man, I say isolation and shame here, but when you have isolation, you create, you create disconnect. You create the inability to have empathy towards something, and something so powerful that everybody feels is sex. This is something, and what we're going to learn here is that this stuff that we all feel, you feel it, I feel it. We might have some different unique things to it, but none of us are talking about it. So we think it's like this weird thing that we've all done. And man, you can build up a lot of shame, but man, when you have isolation, that is what sets up disorder and dysfunction. That is isolation, and isolatory thoughts are the real, villain behind like things like addiction and so on. And connection dissolves that. It's a very cool thing. Okay. So we're in a society and culture that doesn't talk about sex, but the thing is we do talk about sex. We talk about it all the time. And this is going to come into play a little bit later when we talk about the solution in developing groups where you do talk about this. Here's how we talk about sex. Okay. We don't talk about it in a way where it's a personal experience and something real to us. We talk about sex in terms of information. So we talk about, I read this article about sexual health and this is what you're supposed to do. And so and I have kind of found some experience with this, but we're still detached from it, okay? We talk about sex as a joke. That's what we do all the time, man. You get a bunch of, and there's nothing wrong with this. We're going to do this. These are all natural expressions and experience, but we have to get into the real stuff too. But man, if I'm ever talking about sex, I never stop joking about it. It's a funny thing for me, man. It's one of those things that I've always done, but it's not real. It's not connection, and it's not my real expression. We share judgment about sex. That's huge. Man, this is right. This is wrong. When people do this, fuck them. They're bad. That's rape culture. That's, and actually, let's talk about that. We make sex so much about different extremes in order to see it. Not just on the feminist side, but also on the men's movement side, where it's like, we have to be alpha. We have to take what's ours. No, sex is normal. Sex is like, hey, what's going on? Sex has more in common with, hey, what's going on? Like, hey, nice to meet you. Then it would be like, I got to build myself up to do this, or I got to build myself up to hate this or control it. So we talk about taking on the roles that sex gives us. We talk about getting involved with different sexual movements, kind of like the feminist stuff or the ultra, men's movement stuff that doesn't really get into connection and what it is all about. So what we really need to do is start being able to have conversations that are open about what sex is. So the personal conversation about sex that we're missing so much in our culture, man, and this is really, if we're going to look at a problem that we can fix and work on, and not as a problem as blaming other individuals, but the problem that we could solve right now and kind of talk about it and learn to talk about it more in your life and how you can experience and clean your house and your side of the street rather than looking at everybody else's, is let's think about the last time we had a personal conversation about sex. The personal conversations that we have about sex happen when we're in a relationship, when we start having sex, or things get too serious, or there's a problem, or maybe we have to go to therapy for something, or we have to confide in a friend because something happened, we got an STD, or so-and-so cheated on us, we don't know what to do. And then we're starting to have personal conversations about sex. Something that is so normal, so natural, something that is our instinctive expression. And one of the, hindering parts of this is that it actually happens, in puberty, or, when we're 10, 12, 9, 15, whatever different ages, that, we've already learned our social communication by then, and now this new wave happens. But by then, we're intermixed into a culture that is already kind of saying, man, this isn't the best thing to talk about. And then the thought of bringing up yourself sexually, Jesus Christ, that's terrifying. What can happen? I mean, if we bring ourselves up sexually, dude, we have all sorts of consequences. We could get our reputation ruined. We could get taglined as a misogynist. We could get, hurt more if we bring up something vulnerable and are judged for it. We could get made fun of for it. All sorts of different things can be misinterpreted. So we're afraid to talk about it. Now we've taken this extremely normal thing that is a part of being a human, that is one of your greatest qualities, and we've made it totally abnormal and dependent upon exaggerations, extremes, and novelties just to experience it. Okay? Man, that is one of the big parts of where we're going wrong with a lot of this. And that's also where we've got to look for a solution in it. Okay, so now let's talk about porn. Man, the great enemy of men. women, and sexual health. All right, so porn has been around a long time. Let's actually just first establish that. Stag films, print magazines, erotic literature, and then moving into video porn. Video porn when we had to plug in the VHS movies and all those sorts of things. They go into the video store, and behind those barn doors, man, that was always where the good stuff was. And then the internet age came along and made porn super accessible and easy to find, view, and consume. Okay, so porn has always had hysteria around it. It's always had hysteria, much like masturbation has had a lot of hysteria around it, much like sex has had a lot of hysteria around it. And these are ways that, man, it freaks us out so bad we don't know how to talk about it, so we talk about it in terms of panic. It's one of the worst ways to find a solution. I get it that panic happens, and I fall into panic, and I get all pissed off and fucked up about things. But man, that is not how we find our solutions and our equilibrium. So basically, look, check this out. We hear a lot of stuff about porn, but here's the kicker, guys. We've always heard this about porn. Okay, so we hear porn is an act of violence. It's an act of abuse. It's an act of abuse towards women, towards men, towards the women and men who consume it, the women and men who do it. It destroys women's sexuality. It destroys men sexually. It's a sign of a psychological disorder. People that get involved in it are bad. People that watch it, people that do it, and so on. It makes me a bad person. Porn is ruining your life. We hear this all the time. Porn it causes sexual dysfunction. These things are not just recently being said. They've always been said about porn. They've always been propagated in these different ways. I actually remember, the first time I saw porno. So we had porno mags when I was younger, and a kid threw the porno mag. It was in whatever grade, like sixth grade or something, or maybe even younger than that. But he had one. He had stolen it, from his dad or whoever he got it, right? And we all knew, we had it, and we freaked out because we were kids, because we were looking at something bad. It was so powerful. We couldn't, we're all lying to ourselves going no, man, this is cool, but I don't need to look at it or whatever. Da, da, da. I remember they took it and they were angry at it, and they threw it. All right, get this thing out of my hand. It was this weird thing, but we were all into it. I just remember the obsession of saying I had to go to the bathroom just so I could go back in the bushes and find that porno mag in class. This is just something where that comes into play. And this is interesting because we're not going to talk about this too much, but one of the characteristics of addiction is obsession and compulsion. Well, when we get into a sexual state, we actually have a healthy feeling of obsession and compulsion that comes into play. It's what happens, man. It's not a choice for us. It's something that happens, man. We gotta cave to that. That's good. When we have a feeling of sexuality, we have to learn to think within it rather than work against it or think there's right or wrong ways of having it. Sex is an expression before it's a boundary, and a boundary is only needed when we need to make rules and we've kind of screwed ourselves up around it. Okay, so internet porn is ruining your life. Okay, that's what we hear now. And we hear a lot of different evidence towards this, and it's really good, man. And a lot of it is true. It's causing violence towards women. It's causing an objectifying view towards women. It's harming men's sexual lives. It reroutes our brains. It's something that is destroying families or whatever. And people get really dramatic about this stuff. And there's some truths to this. In fact, we can very easily find evidence of how this could be true for us or true for somebody that we know. All right. It's very easy. It's man, porn is ruining your life. People get consumed with it. It makes you think of sex in the wrong ways. It makes you think of your penis size in the wrong way. It makes you think of pussy and tits. It makes you think of women. It makes you think of fucking in the wrong ways. It reroutes your neural pathways, all sort of stuff. You can very easily find evidence for that, okay, in your life. And it's actually interesting because the propagation of the drugs and alcohol, so crack, destroying cities. It destroys people's lives. I have personal experience where, my friends have died from doing crack. Crack is a fucked up drug. It's a totally fucked up drug. But what's interesting about a lot of those things and the propaganda that came out with it? If you look at the studies of those cities where crack was hit the worst, poverty was the same, crime was the same, domestic abuse was the same before crack. But it made it real easy for us to have a war on drugs. Now, that's a totally separate problem than the personal problem that somebody has with drug addiction and so on. Man, we can see the same thing here with porn. Okay. We have a lot of different evidence that is kind of incomplete that we've shown people that we can relate with and say is true. And all of a sudden we have an enemy to blame, an enemy to point the finger at, and somebody to get some applause and like some sort of TED talk or, whatever for, some adoration basically for coming up with this great idea. But man, I can tell you this from working in the solution or working with guys and knowing it from myself and just knowing addiction in general, it's so wrong and so fucked up and actually harms people. It makes them a lot worse. So that being said, look, porn and sexual dysfunction. Okay. We hear about this all the time. The human body was not made for, high fast speed internet streaming porn. It was not made for that. The neural pathways, are being rewritten, and that makes it impossible for us to be able to have sex with a real human being with us. And now there's all this dysfunction. There's this massive amount. If we show the graphs of sexual dysfunction, okay, if we show the graphs of what has happened, once internet porn came up with younger men, it's gone way up. It's gone massively, massively up. Okay. So obviously, this is clearly the problem. Okay. But it's only part of the story. Okay. And we're going to get into this here, in a little bit. But, just really quickly, what's left out of that and and it's so interesting that this is portrayed as science, that no doubt the sexual dysfunction has gone up in men in all sorts of different ways. And nobody's ever super, super specific about that. And nobody's ever super, super specific about the different types of people that are getting that dysfunction. But no doubt it's gone up since internet porn. But if you actually took the measurements of all the people watching porn, which is massive amounts, and all the people that has affected, it's a very small percentage. And man, nobody talks about that. Why? Because you can't make your fucking point with it. It doesn't sound as good. You don't have as much of a scapegoat with it. So basically, let's get into sexual dysfunction and let's talk about it as a normal thing. First off, let's just point this out. Every sexually active man has had a form of sexual dysfunction in his life. So why are we calling it a dysfunction? If it is a common thing, if it's a phenomenon that happens and that happens at specific times, why are we calling it a dysfunction? And that is one of the big, big problems with it and what screws it all up. So the common dysfunctions that happen and that we hear about and work with all the time are premature ejaculation, sexual performance anxiety, the inability to get an erection, the inability to maintain an erection, and then poor thoughts about sex like judgment, violence, anger, evil thoughts towards women, hate, all those sorts of things. Okay. With or without porn, these dysfunctions will happen in your life. They are normal occurrences. So why are we calling them dysfunctions? These are things that are going to happen that nobody talks about. Again, we don't talk about sex. We joke about it. We make judgments about it. We get all this, crazy stuff about it, but nobody personally talks about their sexual experiences. And this is the shit that happens. When these normal things happen, they can really rattle us and totally fucks us up. So porn makes them worse. This is true. Okay. If you have these normal dysfunctions or occurrences or phenomenons that happen, once you start watching porn and getting used to it and all those sorts of things, it can make those things worse. But really, it's not just there. It's not just that makes it worse. Okay, it's not just the consumption of porn. That can for certain individuals, but a very specific set of individuals. These are the people that, and we'll get into it, may have had problems with sex, may have had trauma. Maybe they have suffered from some addiction thing, and an addiction isn't something that people argue about this in our society and culture. I agree. It's something that you're born with, but we weren't made or evolved to be drug addicts or have addictive personalities. Our culture activates something in what, our thought process is, and that's how it starts. So here's the thing is what made these things worse before we had porn? Or before we had internet porn, or before we had stag films, and there were just stories and hieroglyphics about people fucking or whatever, is when there's cultures, households, or religions with poor views on sex and an attempt to confine sex with heavy consequences, guess what? all of these same problems get accentuated. All of these same problems, like not being able to get it up, which is normal. That's going to happen to you if you're sexually active. Inability to ejaculate. That's going to happen if you're sexually active at some point. Ejaculating too soon. That's going to happen to you at some point. All these different dysfunctions, thinking poorly about sex and women and so on, These are going to happen, but they're going to be more intense if you grew up in a culture, household, or a religion where sex was not talked about and repressed and all sorts of different things. Not that that's bad, but that's just where you're at. Okay? There's no judgment here. So now let's talk about who watches porn. We talked about this, a little bit a couple slides ago, but a lot of people watch porn. Okay? Massive amounts. Currently, as I'm doing this, I think like the porn sites are like 50th on the Alexa rating, which is like what rates all the websites. But they used to be more, man. They used to be up there with like, 5 or 4, like, the top sites were all porn websites. People watch porn, okay? But now let's get into this. How many people watch a lot of porn? All right? There are tons of men and women who watch a lot of porn. In fact, that was one of the biggest revelations that I had when I was working in the dating scene and really, I still work in the dating scene, but really active in the dating scene when I wasn't in a relationship and settled down and stuff. When I would talk to women, there was actually one woman. I mean, this is like hundreds of women that I had different relationships with. There's only one that said that she had never watched porn. And there were pretty much the rest of them that said they watched a lot of porn. You could literally go up and open a girl and say, hey, I got a question. It kind of says something about your personality type. And I don't really judge about sex, but like, what's your favorite kind of porn? Do you like the really soft stuff or like the really crazy stuff? And the crazy thing is, well, most of the people think they like crazy stuff because nobody talks about sex. So they all say that. Is it really crazy? Usually not. But anyway, the thing is everybody watches porn. So if everybody was watching porn, that would mean that if porn was really ruining our lives, we would have an overwhelming amount of men. This wouldn't be like 10%, which is a lot. And it's not 10% who are running into these major sexual dysfunctions. And we'll talk about that. It would be a massive amount of men. Okay. The statistics of somebody who tries like crystal methamphetamines or crack or heroin, and the percentages are different for those drugs, but they revolve around 10% to 20% will develop a chemical dependency problem with those, which is actually kind of low. Like we have this idea that, 90% of people who try heroin will be addicted to it. It's actually like 20% or somewhere around that number who actually build up a physical need, a mental need, an emotional need for that high and have it actually ruin their lives and become drug addicts and so on. But the thing is that with porn, we're not finding that those numbers match up. And that's the shitty thing, man. When we see that J graph of like sexual dysfunction has gone up, no doubt it has. Why? Because it was already there and now we're making it worse. Okay. And we'll get into that a little bit here in a second. But man, the numbers of people watching porn are far higher than that, and they do not match. Okay. Now, that's not the only hole in this, and there's like some major holes, especially when we get into the solution. That's where the real problem begins. But man, look, basically, if you're, porn, sex problems, your issues internally, and those things that relate around sex have so much more to do with you personally and your cultural expression. And that's where the solution is going to be found. So let's look at this. All right. Who is having these sexual dysfunctions? All right. So in order to look at this, let's take just kind of a brief look at these things. And I really wish that this was compartmentalized more in the kind of porn studies that they talk about. And I'm sure they do have these, but they just don't talk about them because it wouldn't add up into a lot of the different, if they haven't, it's really, really harmful. And it really pisses me off because I know so many guys who visited sex therapists and guys that are working on the cutting edge and all this sort of shit. And they actually fuck themselves up worse, but they never look at this. Okay. And this is basically like, let's look at who has sexual dysfunction, who has these sexual problems with or without porn. Okay. Who has sustained sexual dysfunction. Okay, so we talked about it, like everybody's going to have these periods of time, and especially if you're young, if you're a young man and you don't have a lot of sexual experience, you're going to have a lot of performance issues. You're going to have performance anxiety. You're not going to be able to get it up. There's plenty of guys. For me personally, I was always able to get it up, but I'd come too quick, or I'd freak out, or I'd get really angry about different things, or I'd have different, thoughts about sex that, that thought I was like, oh my God, I'm like into this violent, like abusive, horrible stuff. I'm this horrible man. But there's guys who build up anxiety around not being able to get it up, or have that phenomenon happen, that are inexperienced, that won't be able to maintain an erection, won't be able to get off or complete an orgasm. And they really think there's something wrong with them. Okay. Those guys, well, we'll talk about this. That has more to do with inexperience than actually like a problem that goes along with it. Now, a sustained sexual problem, that means it goes on for years. That means it continues. That means even after you've had some experience to overcome it, it's still existing, and it's really frustrating. You don't know where to begin with it. And also we have to look at who had these problems before porn or internet porn existed. And when we can look at that, we can actually find out, okay, well, wait a minute. What is the norm? What is the real human expression? So who has sexual dysfunction naturally? That's when it happens. And, it kind of goes away over time. And when I say over time, that may be 6 months, that may be 2 years, but this happens all the time. Okay, man, it's all the time. Guys who are 18, they're 24, and they come on our calls and they're like, man, I'm coming too quick. I can't get it up. I freaked out. How do we do with this? Like I looked at all this stuff, and it says I'm watching too much porn. And anytime I Google, like sexual anxiety or inability to get it up or these types of things, like, man, like it's saying that this is a problem. I have an addiction, and there's like all this guilt comes into play. It's totally screwed up. Look, this is normal. This is what's going to happen. And more of how we're looking at this is that when you're 20, when you're 24, or you're just inexperienced and you haven't had a lot of experience with sex and women, that this is a phenomenon and this is part of your sexual journey. And it's great, man. It's cool. And there's all sorts of different stuff. We could talk about what you can do to help prevent those things. We could talk about what you can do when you can't get hard and you're inexperienced and you're with a girl. You could very easily say, hey, look, I'm sorry. There's other ways to have sex though. Like sometimes this happens my first time when I'm with somebody. Sometimes this happens when I don't know somebody, or this never happens to me. I don't know what's going on, but let's find other ways to do it. There's so many different ways to have sex that don't have to do with just a dick and a pussy or the things that we think sex is. Sex is so much more. We'll talk about that as well. And also sexually inexperienced men. So let's say you're not a young man, and let's say you're divorced, but you didn't have sex for the last 2 or 3, 4, 10 years of your marriage or whatever it is, and you're out of it. Dude, when you're back in the sexual game, there's a lot of anxiety. Okay, so what really causes this? And it's terrible, man. When you're there and you're with a beautiful chick, or you're with a girl that you should be turned on with, and you want to have sex, and it's just not happening, you can be thinking all you want, you can be doing all you want, your dick is not going to go anywhere. When you're in that mode, and for whatever specific reasons it's happening, man, but it happens, and it happens to everybody who's sexually active, and especially a lot and consistently to men who are inexperienced or so young that they don't have that experience, that guess what? Man, there's nothing you can do. Guess what happens? You feel bad. You feel inadequate. You're like, fuck, does my dick work? Jesus Christ. Okay, I'm going to go jerk off afterwards. Blah, 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 blah. It's totally frustrating, and it's very common to feel bad about it. But we've got to get out of that judgment. We've got to get out of that shame. And we've got to start dialoguing and talking about how common this is, especially with sexually inexperienced men. And if you were ever on our calls, you would know how common this is of a question. Okay, so the more you freak out about it, the worse you're going to make it. All right? You have got to realize that this is a normal thing. There's plenty of stuff that you can do or say. A lot of people say, well, then you can eat her pussy and give her an orgasm. Sure, you can do that, but don't do it because you think you need to somehow please her or make up for you not performing. Believe me, she feels just as bad about you not being able to get it up as, actually, I was just talking to a waitress about this yesterday. We actually asked her, what's the fastest time you've made a man come? And she was like, oh man, oh Jesus Christ, that's really fast, da 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 da. And she went all into this thing. And she was like, I can't say specifically because, I don't know you guys well enough. But then we actually asked her, we said, okay, so what's worse, not being able to come or coming fast? And she's like, not being able to come. That's horrible. When you can't make a guy come or he can't get hard for you, it's a God, man, Jesus Christ. So for her, it affects her just as much. She's not judging you for it. In fact, more than anything, sadly, she's judging herself. So that's a really shitty thing. You're in a bedroom, you can't perform or she can't perform or whatever, and then both of you guys judge each other rather than work through it and communicate and connect and find different ways to express sexuality. It sucks. So we're going to categorize and title that one is those who have sexual dysfunction that's a natural phenomenon. So really it's not a dysfunction. It's something that happens, okay? So who has sustained sexual dysfunction? All right? So who has sustained sexual dysfunction in the era of porn? Okay, these are men who are inexperienced, but then because they're inexperienced and they have those natural problems, they build up a heightened anxiety about sex. This happens. No big deal, man. If that's you, look, we're not judging you. It happens to so many different guys. And now there's tons of reasons for that happening now more than ever, with just people talking about the hysteria around sex and how crazy it is. Because along with porn on the rise, that's on the rise too. We've always had hysteria around sex, but now it's like, Jesus Christ, it's everywhere. Say something about sex and like you're vilified for life. It's funny because the Sexual Life, the site that I founded, which is not porn, actually comes up as a porn site when you're looking in libraries and so on, when it's actually sharing good information about like sexual health and men and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so also people who've experienced trauma when it comes to sex. So if you've had trauma in your life, which, I mean, I have. I mean, Jesus, I mean, that was one of the places where I started from. Like, no big deal. It's all good. You know, you're welcome. You're able to express, you're able to actually have a good sex life. That doesn't mean that you're going to have a bad sex life, but those are the types of people that in the era of porn tend to have a sustained sexual dysfunction. Okay, so it progresses, it gets worse, it continues, it just maintains at a level of where it's not fully performing. Okay, men who come from cultural or religious backgrounds and viewpoints that have sex in a poor light. It's much more common that if you come from that background, that you will have more sexual dysfunction, especially when you're working outside of your culture. So if you're somebody that's coming from a culture, let's say outside of the US, I mean, I live in the US, so I'm using that as an example, but it's more sexually conservative. You don't talk about it. In fact, you look at it poorly, your parents do, and so on. And then you come to the US and you see it as this like oversexed culture, which it's really not. Everybody talks about sex, they joke about it, they gossip about it, but they don't actually like really personally talk about it. It seems like this big deal. It's very easy to build up more anxiety. Hence the isolation, the anxiety, the shame, the guilt. Those are the real things that are going to make your sex life bad and have you all these, or allow these dysfunctions to really have ground and room to grow on. Okay. Men who have a poor view of sex, themselves, or women. So it's either or of those. You know, it could be one of those, it could be multiple of it. But if you have a poor view of sex, if you have a poor view of yourself, if you have a poor view of women, it's very easy to get lost in that. We see this a lot, especially in the dating realm. It's not super common, but hey, if this is you, no big deal. Let's work on it, man. You know, let's get past it. But if, you know, you hate women or have a lot of reasons for that, and, you know, that's fine. It doesn't mean that you have to for the rest of your life, or it doesn't mean that you have to love them. What it means is that you can, if you work on yourself in different ways, to learn how to express and enjoy and have a good sex life with all the different benefits that you have. If you hate yourself, if you hate sex or something, it's very easy to build sustained sexual dysfunction. Now let's go to who has sustained sexual dysfunction before the era of porn. Guess what, guys? It's all the same people. Man. So it's all the same people, inexperienced people who build up too much anxiety, although there's less of those. Why? Because there's less of a reason to build up anxiety. Men who have experienced sexual trauma, men who come from religious backgrounds or cultural backgrounds where sex is framed in a poor light, and people who have problems with their personal view of themselves, views upon women, and views upon sex. So that's pretty crazy. Let's say you're the normal guy. Okay, so the normal guy that's having normal sexual problems that, you know, they're classified as dysfunction. Okay, you're in your 20s, you're in your early 20s, or maybe you're the guy that just got divorced, or a guy that's going through a long stretch where you're not having sex, or you've experienced like some trauma, like a shitty relationship, and now you've just started to date again. That's actually what happened to me, man. It was fucking crazy. So when I was 18, I was also very early, but I didn't have sex from 18 to 21 because some like crazy traumatic shit that happened. And man, that was just, if I could have all that time back and talk to myself from 18 to 28 or 20 to now. It's now all the way from 18. If I could coach myself, it would just be like, hey, look, because my girlfriend at the time, who I lost my virginity to, I'd only had sex like, 8 times or 5 times or something like that. She had gotten kidnapped and gang raped and all this like really horrible stuff. And dude, after we broke up, we broke up 6 months after that, after all this counseling, it was just crazy. Like I was so fried. I didn't talk to a girl for 3 years. And then when I did start having sex again, I thought it was terrible because I was, having all these aggressive thoughts and all this sort of stuff. So check this out. You're a normal guy. You go through your normal experience. Hook up with a chick. You get performance anxiety. And here's one of the things, guys. If you have this and you're hooking up with women and you're in your 20s and you can't get hard, or you come right away, you don't even like have sex with her. You just start coming and you take, your pants don't even come off. A butterfly lands on it. A wisp of air goes by and you blow your load. And the girl's like, oh, geez. And you're all embarrassed and stuff. You're like, fuck. And then you Google performance anxiety. You Google premature ejaculation. You Google inability to maintain an erection or whatever it is that you Google. Can't get hard. Can't get it up. Guess what happens? You get spammed with a bunch of shit selling you like Viagra pills or whatever. But then also you see all these like really well put together talks, articles on how porn is fucking you up, how porn is ruining your life. The worst, man, I'm just going to tell you right now, when dating coaches like myself have things like this, look, something that's always been the case. I've spoken for a long time about sex and sexual health. I would get off the stage. I remember in 2009, that's really when it started. And dating coaches would come up to me and just say like, hey, Steve, you talk about sex a lot. And, do you ever have the thing where you can't get it up with a girl? And I'm like, dude, man, you don't need to be like all private. Like, yeah, but I can't have my clients know. And they'd be these coaches and they'd be talking about this stuff. Man, don't listen to dating coaches about sex advice, except there's a few of them. Listen to Savage's stuff. It's really good. A lot of Zan's stuff is really good. Hypnotica's. But a lot of these guys, it's like they're going through and it's really kind of a screwed up thing. Anyway, I hate to derail it, but back to this normal guy thing is that, a normal guy in his 20s having sex, here's one of the things. Like, look, dude, if you're in a relationship with a girl and you're continuously having sex with her, like for a couple months, you're not going to have these problems. If the problems continue there, then you may need to look deeper. Like, again, if you can get an erection to porn or at other times with women, or when the situation is in a certain environment or setting, or there's not these types of pressure and so on. One thing that, I know from just having a lot of sex and like, look, man, I am a sex addict. I've had sex in crazy scenarios. And when we would have scenarios where there would be some like, group sex thing, it was one of the things that would happen. Like the guys wouldn't be able to get hard. It was like the craziest thing. I mean, they would have never had an erectile problem on the regular in their life. But as soon as there's like 4 chicks, and I'll tell you this, I put this video up, or like many other videos, I'll put this video up and I'll get in the comment section. If you put me in front of 4 women and like a set of cameras, I'll be able to get hard. Man, you sure about that? Because from what I know, unless you're prepared, you won't. But hey, man, that's not everybody, but that's really, really common. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't get hard. But if you're getting hard on in different scenarios, or if you're able to sustain and not ejaculate in certain situations or settings, then you can do that with a girl that you have sex regularly with. If not, then you may have a physiological problem. If not, or if you can't get it on the regular with her, but you can in porn, then it's probably an emotional problem or something that you need to sort out within yourself and your beliefs and so on. You'll have to work at it. We'll talk about that in a second. So you're going to Google a bunch of stuff. Okay, you have a bad experience or a couple bad experiences, or you have bad experiences every time the first time you have sex with somebody. It makes you feel terrible. You Google a bunch of stuff and it tells you, you have an addiction. You are fucked up. There's something wrong with you. Like, this has to do with all sorts of different stuff and how you grew up and porn and blah, 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 blah. And then you start putting the dots in your head, or connecting the dots in your head, and you don't really know where you're going. You start thinking, oh my God, it was because of my religious background. I have so much guilt and I'm fundamentally flawed and I'm totally screwed up and blah, 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 da, da, da. And you mind fuck yourself on it and you totally screw yourself. And the sad part about that is there's no real solution. And now you took a normal, natural problem before the internet existed and all the spamming of information existed. And rather than following the natural route of what most normal guys do, is this happens like for maybe a few months, a few years, even like 2 years of sexual activity. Or like me, I have sexual activity, had some problems. My girlfriend got raped, more problems. Then I can't fucking figure shit out from whatever. We have a lot of sex in that time of 6 months, which it's all over the place and confusing. And then I go for 3 years of no sex, where I'm thinking about it. My hormones are going insane. I want to have sex. I want to talk to girls. I want to do the right thing. I learned how to write love letters and all this stupid shit. And like nothing works. And then I start having sex, you know, when I'm 21, 22. I don't even know what the fuck's going on. Then I need 2 more years to sort it out there. Jesus Christ, man. But so for me, it was a lot longer, right? But the thing is that it'll pass. Okay, normal guy, it'll pass. Experience will sort itself out. But now you're being told there's a problem. You build up all this anxiety. Our culture doesn't talk about sex. It's a big secret. It's more of an isolatory thing. You're not going to talk to your friends about it. You're only going to talk about people in confidence, and it's a bigger deal rather than this normal and naturally, like, you know, sex has more in common with saying hello and what's up and how's life going than all this other stuff that we make it. So it is now, the problem is now compounded. It is just totally fucked up and crazy. Okay. So, you know, you try the recommended, you know, path for recovery, and what does a sex addict do, or what does a guy who's addicted to porn or have bad thoughts about women do? And man, it's really an impossible thing that you're being asked to do when your hormones are pumping. It sucks, man, but nothing can repress us like a secret and shame. And that's what we communicate with sex in. Okay. So let's then say you have a sustained sexual dysfunction. You're one of the dudes that, you know, it's just not getting better. It's not solving itself out. You're not the natural guy who just kind of has a problem with sexual performance. You're a guy that continues to have it. You've done everything, man. You sort out all this sort of stuff. You get really into the porn addiction stuff. You believe it. I mean, man, look, there's so much to that is so theorized. And then there is so little to it that has ever had anybody recover from it. Man, like if you really ever work with somebody who has had sexual addiction, how many people beat it and live? And I don't even want to say beat it, because I don't really think about addiction in those ways. I feel, in my personal theory, and you're welcome to your own, and if you get into it, explore it, it's great. But I'm very proud of being an addict, and I never think I beat it. I think it's a part of me. It's a part of me that exists. And when you can get past all the bullshit, all the shame, it turns into this like really, really cool stuff. But you just got to know it, man. And we'll get into this as we talk about the different issues that you may develop in living that way. But the thing is that, man, if you looked like, don't look at the research they're presenting you, look at the research of the solution of men and women who have gone that route of the traditional kind of like suggested therapeutic route of sexual addiction that a lot of those videos and stuff and articles propose. How many of them got healthy? Now, and we'll get into this a little bit later. Maybe those people didn't really have a big problem, to which then, you know, it's just experience would help them out, whether they took action on it or not. But man, how many people who really had a fucking problem got better? Now, you never see those cases. You never see them. We have those cases a lot with what we've done. Okay. And it's very consistent. Okay. So anyway, you go through this deal, you stop masturbating for 90 days, you rewire your brain, you stop thinking about objectification, you stop thinking about like, you know, oh my God, like, geez, you know, I can't have these bad habits. I have so much like, you know, anger towards sex or whatever it is. Yeah. It's a different mindset. If it's a different brain, you got to get used to it. And you're like, you go through this is the best part. You go through the 30 days, the 90 days of no ejaculation. You hook up with a girl, you have a hard dick. It's fucking working again. You fucking, you know, come a boatload because you've been holding back for so long. And even though you came too fast, you can go again because you're so into her. Why? Because your body is overwhelmed and you're really having sex with a reaction and not anything. You're not getting past all the different emotional, mental, belief, and even, you know, physical and maybe cognitive things that, or, you know, maybe it is neuropathway things that need to be really fixed. And you think you've beat the problem. You have sex for a few weeks, a few months, and then the problem comes back, or you break up and it can't happen again. And you go and this is the thing. You're like, what the fuck? I beat it. I stopped watching porn. I did everything they said. Why isn't this working? Shit. Goddamn. Jesus Christ. So and then all those guys who have that real problem, and especially if they truly are a sex addict, it gets worse. The problem compounds. They go deeper into the darkness, so to speak, deeper into the secret, deeper into the shame, deeper into the like, I am isolated, I can't be fixed. Why? Because you got a fucking incomplete answer to a very simple solution that these assholes who cover like the porn and sex addiction, whatever stuff, are propagating. And it fucking sucks, man. It's horrible, you know, because you think you're doing good, but 3 months, 6 months later, you're worse, man. Maybe less than that. So the proposed solution is this, okay? The proposed solution, and there are some variables, but it's generally go without watching porn. Don't watch it anymore. It'll trigger, you know, old behavior and it will make things worse, okay? Not a bad suggestion, you know, never watch porn again, okay? That's the problem, okay? Do not masturbate for 30 or 90 days. So don't ejaculate, don't masturbate. And you want to rewrite the neural pathways in your head through some sort of behavioral therapy or talk therapy. And, you know, all those things are like some great suggestions, but once again, they're incomplete, okay? So we're not masturbating, we're not watching porn, we're not ejaculating. And sometimes, this is very common too, it's recommended, especially if it's assumed that you're a sex addict, that you don't have sex for 30 to 90 days. Okay, so don't have sex. Don't have sex with yourself or any sexual activity with another person for 30 or 90 days. Why? Because you got to rewrite your brain, man, the neural pathways, all the stuff. Again, stuff that really like is not researched enough, you know? I mean, just the variables are not taken into consideration. Okay, and then sometimes, this is another thing that I've heard, and it's actually really common and it's sad, especially because a lot of my like hardcore sex addict friends, they go to like the hardcore sex addict therapist, so they get the hardcore, like the regimen. And more than a few have been recommended to like, okay, but you got to rewrite the way your brain thinks and your neural pathways and so on. And there's all this research on it. So you can go on dates with women, but no physical contact for 5 dates up to 20 dates. That's insane. Okay. So here's what happens. Okay. So first off, hardly anybody can stick with this, let alone the no masturbation thing. So if you're a normal guy that's just going through that normal phase in your life where you are running into sexual problems, you freak out about this. Okay. You try and not masturbate. And if you can sustain and not masturbate for the like whatever 90-day no fap regimen or whatever, and not watch porn or whatever it is, and you get really into it, but you want to do it, then here's what happens. You either do it and get more of a neurosis built up and anxiety about how dangerous sex could be when you were going through a natural phenomenon, which can allow you to go into some deeper areas, or you break because you can't do it and you didn't watch porn for, 45 days or whatever, or you didn't masturbate for X amount of days, but you see how it helped you and it really helped you get past that point. And now you're having like a normally sexual life and, you're still not fucking like a porn star, but you're not having the same problems that you did those few times. Or when you do, it's really rare and you get over them. Okay. That's kind of what happens, right? That's normally what happens. Guess what else that happens when you don't do any of this shit? Okay. So the normal guy, the average, when we look at that J graph of all the sexual dysfunction that goes up, of young men searching for, the answer of premature ejaculation, or young men questioned about it. Fuck, man. Guess what? Like if you did nothing and you're a normal, sexually active and healthy guy that doesn't have any experience, kind of like what I was, who even went through some severe trauma around it, guess what? If you keep on having sex, you normalize and regulate it. And the more you think there's a problem, the less it makes you able to make sex normal. But when you can make sex normal, it figures itself out. Here's the deal. If you're somebody who has a reoccurring sexual problem, where does this help? Where this can help is only in the, well, not only, but you make this big push to not watch porn because that's the problem and that fucks you up. Because when we get in a sexual state, we get obsessive, we get compulsive, we get hyper focused on it, but we're supposed to, you're always going to, and that's a good thing. And you have to learn how to regulate and control that and come to know it rather than fear it and think it's an evil thing, which is kind of propagated by this. You don't masturbate for 30 or 90 days, you don't ejaculate, but the real stuff is going to happen in your therapy. So behavioral and talk therapy. But the problem with that is there's so much judgment wrapped up around it. Don't think about bad things. Don't, objectify women or looking at these ways. That's the violent side. I mean, this is a real thing. So, man, God, like one thing I'll say, like when my girlfriend was kidnapped, and this was, 20 years ago, Jesus, this was 20 years ago. But when the police were doing their detective work, they did it so like I would be accused for it because they wanted to get as much. That's what cops do. I didn't realize that's what cops did until like years and years later when I saw documentaries on investigators and what they did. But man, I heard all the details about it. I actually heard all the details about it, not just from them, but from the girl that I was dating. It was horrible. It was fucking horrible. And they didn't catch the guys until the guy was just tried for it, 20 years later. They didn't catch the guys for 16 years after that with new DNA evidence or whatever. But the thing is about it, so there was all this unresolved stuff around it. It's really, really horrible, right? So the thing is that, man, when I started having sex again, when I was like 24, when I started having it a lot, I liked it. Like when a girl asked me to choke her. Holy shit, man. I'd never fucking seen that. Yeah, I'd seen it in porn, but I'd never had it like said to me. She would like slap my ass, put your fingers in my mouth. I was like, what the fuck? And I liked it. Oh my God. I'm that violent guy that's just like the dudes that raped him. Maybe it's because they raped him. Maybe it's because you mind fuck yourself and you just totally screw yourself up. And so what happens when I walk into the bedroom and I go, man, there's this dark, brooding secret behind me with a new girl where I start to have a relationship with her. I just hook up with her. And then I have to hide something sexually. Wait, there's this like violent thing and it contaminated me because, my girlfriend was raped and I guess I secretly liked it or whatever. And you just mind fuck yourself. Man, it's so stupid, man. So when behavioral therapy comes from a point of judgment, it can't really go anywhere. It really, really, especially with sex and how limiting we talk about sex in our culture, it fucks everything up. So if you have a reoccurring problem, a lot of the times you have to find a good therapist that knows the right direction to get you to open up and to have no judgment, man. It's like one of the best things. If you can exist in a world of that, it's great. But usually that doesn't happen. So it doesn't work. Part of it works. But then when you're left to your own responsibility time, man, really listen to this. This is the most fucked up thing that you're going to go through. If you have this as a sustained problem of sexual dysfunction, you do some therapy, it gets better, man, the new therapist is great, or this new regimen of, getting sexually healthy is the way to go, man. It's fucking awesome. That's good. Okay, cool. They can start letting me on my own, start doing my own thing. Then all of a sudden it gets worse. Why? Not because there's something wrong with you, but because there was something wrong with the plan and the model, that it needed all this like control and confinement and accountability to sustain it. Your sex life needs to regulate and be normal and natural. You need to get to that. And then let's say if you're a sex addict, here's the best part. So there's really three categories. There's the normal guy, there's the guy that has repetitious and a continued sexual dysfunction. And then there's the sex addict who actually like has sex to the point where he'll like ruin his life. I mean, like just go crazy with it. Like it's just nuts. The disease of addiction means you're obsessive and compulsive when your mind isn't in the sexual state. When you're always that way, chasing, something outside of yourself to make yourself feel better. And the crazy thing about sexual addiction is that you have to have sex to be a complete human being. Drug addiction, you don't have to have drugs to be a complete human being. You can cut that shit out. You can abstain from it. Actually, I talk about this in the article, but the great thing and bad thing about drug addiction is the consequences are so obvious. Like people are dying all the time. It's really actually quite sad, but I know people that I work with that I've gotten to know very well that pass away. And with sexual addiction, you get a lot of embarrassment. You get a lot of shame. You get STDs. You get bad relationships and all sorts of really bad shaming consequences, but it's not so obviously like fucked up as where you see with people who have drug problems. And I'd even say with solely alcohol problems, it's just not as extreme when you get to people who are, like IV users and stuff like that. So here's what happens with the sex addict, man. This is impossible for him. This is the best part. The sex addict advice is start here. You're going to stop. You're going to not do these things because you have to in order for me to work with you. This is what you hear from the sex therapist. You have to break it. What are you telling this person? This person cannot do this. It is impossible. He's got to be a part of a group. He's got to be a part of a support system. Like you are telling somebody who has lived in every part of his or her body, his sense of self, his sense of pain, his sense of pleasure, their sense of, awareness and linking in the world is usually revolved around this expression of the addiction. And you're telling them to stop it immediately. There are so many variables that life puts in front of you that will confuse the living shit out of this person and they will break. 30 to 90 days of forcing this without a support group or without confinement, like you locking them up, man, that's not going to happen. Okay. You're going to break from it. And let's say you can power through it for the very, very slim amount that force themselves to adhere by this. That is hard, man. That is hard shit. That first year, that first 90 days. I mean, that's a big difference. 3 months, the first 3 months, the first 12 months. Hard time, especially when you're dealing with somebody who has a true addiction. You're going to tell them just to stop? And no, they will break. They'll move into a more progressive state and a higher level of dysfunction. This is what I see happen with guys who are true sex addicts. I knew this guy, and it sucks, man. He couldn't complete his orgasm. He oftentimes couldn't get an erection, those types of things. And he would have sex all the time and try and fuck up and get all pissed off about it. And even with girlfriends. So this was a real big problem, man. He had a big problem with it, with sexual dysfunction and sexual addiction of seeking sex in all these different ways. Dude, this guy went to a sex therapist and he was like, man, it was porn. That was the problem. That was it. This was a big, deal for me. And, I stopped it and all of a sudden I could get erections again. He started dating his ex-girlfriend. Oh man, this was the worst part. He started dating his ex-girlfriend again. He was the guy that said, you can't touch a girl for the first 20 dates. He started dating his ex-girlfriend again and not touching her. And then as soon as he did, he could start having sex again and he could have sex again successfully. As soon as they broke up, man, that guy went deeper into a sexual addiction than I've seen in a long time. It's totally fucked up, man. He ruined his fucking life, man. It's a little bit better now, but it's fucking crazy. It's fucking crazy. It's insane, man. It's insane. It was just shitty. And again, not focusing on the solution. So here's the problem with the solution. Of course, we've been talking about it a lot, but really cut and dry. When you abstain from sex or physical stimuli, sexual stimuli, guess what? Your body starts having erections and ejaculating on its own. Your functioning starts to come back. But at the same time, that's from a repression and that's from a confinement. Sex is an expression. It is not something that is made to be put in a box. Okay, if somebody's a sex addict, this will make them worse. If you're a normal guy, this sort of regimen can build up a lot of anxiety because you don't need it. You would have gotten the same results if you just went on your path for a couple of years and figured it out. Or you got into a group where guys talked about this and, you'd be able to get into better functioning of what actually happens and the experience of masculinity and sex and how you grew up with it. And if you're a guy that has a reoccurring problem, it's going to leave out the components of the therapy, most likely that are necessary that will help you. Look, I'm going to tell you right now that it may be good for you to put the brakes on some things, but man, to force and regulate to the degree that it's said, there's just not a lot of people who've found sexual health out of that. There's people that may have put a halt on a behavior and then learn to hate themselves for it and build up all this tension to maintain that. It's no good. All right. As long as there's blame involved, there's no solution. Okay. So as long as you are pointing the finger at anything other than yourself, there's no solution. So even in this, I'm saying, man, culture's fucked up. So what? I'm just saying that so that you can be aware of it and start to see how it affects you in your life personally. But man, if you sit there and blame culture, if you sit there on the sideline saying it's because of this, because of that, or the other thing, you will never get to the solution. Okay. The problem with hysteria, blame, and scapegoating is it gives us a false sense of relief and it makes us think that we have the problem solved when nothing is solved. Okay. There's no doubt that there's plenty of bad qualities about porn. We didn't get into the whole thing of like, it's violence against women, it's violence against men. It like puts a ill perception on whatever, all this sort of stuff. But guess what? All of those things would be lessened if we took the fucking blame out of it. Okay. And let's look at this, man. We put the value of a lot of things like image or success or capital or all these different things on stuff in the world. Well, guess what? When something's a secret and you live in a capitalistic system, and there's nothing wrong with living in a capitalistic system, I very much like it. But when you build a secret within that, when you build something that you're afraid to talk about within that, guess what? Man, you build capitalism around it. And that's what porn is. I mean, Jesus Christ, man, it's an expression of who we are. Like, it's just so obvious that it happened, but it's like we talk about it as if we can control it or blame it. And we've, shit, man, we've been doing it ever since sex became gossip. Ever since sex became a topic outside of the bedroom, man, everybody's turned it into this weird opinion of how we can somehow control it. In any case, let's get to what works. Okay. Remember when I said in the past 10 years, we've worked with, a bunch of different men successfully solving their different sexual dysfunctions and managing sexual addiction. And those two things are very different. Like, so here's the thing. So it's very common, okay, for when a guy, it's kind of like 1 out of 10. If a guy seeks out some of the services that we have on social dynamics and sex, 1 out of 10 of those guys is going to come into, the question and seeking out for different advice with the topics of sexual dysfunction. Okay, it's very common, man. It's probably more than 1 out of 10 people have it. It definitely is who've experienced it. It's everybody who's experienced it. If we go into just like not being able to get it up a few times, but 1 out of 10 actually comes with that being their impetus. Okay, that is their motive. Okay, and they've usually worked with some other coaches. They've researched a lot of different stuff that goes into the anti-porn or the rerouting of intimacy and getting away from these misogynistic views. Or they take on this other thing like, I need to be more misogynistic in order to have this, rather than seeing sex as normal. Okay, look, there's a whole bunch wrong with that. Why? Because anytime you see sex as nothing that is normal and it has to be an exaggeration, an abnormality, or that it's not something that we do, then it takes it out of its nature. So there's nothing ever wrong with the specific methodology from where they're trying to learn from, whether it's hypnosis, talk therapy, whatever, right? A different form of coaching. What's wrong with it is the fundamental philosophy that is backing it. Okay. Now, also, if you're working at this, any suggestions that I propose on it, it's not a quick fix. Okay. If you come into this and you're saying that I want something quick and something that I won't have to work on and really look at myself and get honest with myself about, then man, good luck to you, for the next X amount of years until the pain gets great enough. And that is the problem when it comes to drug addiction. The pain gets fucking bad. Okay, and you either die or you fix it. When it comes to sex addiction, somehow the pain just isn't enough. And here's the thing, is because your shame exists in relationships and sex, but it probably doesn't exist in your work. It doesn't exist in the different distractions that you can have in your life. And that's the sad thing about things like drug addiction, gambling addiction, food addiction, is there's different things in your life that you can highlight to make yourself feel good. When you have a drug problem, that's like fucking everything, man, and you fuck yourself up. So look, if you want to work at something that is this deep, and it is normal. I want to say it's normal and natural, and it will be easy once we get on the road. But if you're unwilling to dedicate 6 to 12 months to approach a new way of having a healthy sex life, then man, forget about it. It's not going to work for you. You can go on, continue being confused, or find something else that works for you. And I hope it does, but I've just never seen it work out. And another thing that you need to think about sexual health and social health is you're going to have it for the rest of your life. You need to have it with that mentality that it's something that you work at every day. In terms of sexual health, like for me, it probably hit to a really high degree where it was like, oh my God, this is like my bottom sexually, was when I was like 31, 32. It was just, I can't do this anymore. I was already on a long road with my, chemical dependency addiction, and like felt really good and confident about that. But the sexual addiction was like, Jesus Christ, this is crazy. I'm 38 now. It's a big part of my life. It's a big part of my life to make sure my connections and communications are good with who I am, and I could still screw up. Okay. And especially if you are somebody who's hit that level of sexual addiction, you're going to have some baggage that is now reshaped into your expression. That is now a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. So the fundamental philosophy of where we come from that is a lot different than what other people do is that sex is normal. You need to have sex and you need to be sexual. This is going to be huge in what makes you healthy. Fundamentally, whether you're a sex addict, whether you have long-term sexual dysfunction, or you're just a little bit confused about what's been happening in the bedroom and things have been a little bit off, what is going to solve this issue, and it's going to give you your sexual health, is a consistent and consecutive experience, or consistent and consecutive experiences of positive sexual experiences. That's what's going to help you. Okay. Now, how you get there is going to be a little bit different if you're a sex addict, if you're somebody who has repeat dysfunction, or you're somebody that is kind of on the normal side and just, not really finding that true empowerment of yourself sexually. Okay. So depending upon where you're at is how you're going to find out the different path that you're on. Okay. One thing to also point out here is chemical dependency addiction is much different than sex addiction. I hear people make the correlation all the time. Here's the thing that's the same, the addiction part, the obsession, the compulsion, the need to find more, the endless search for something outside of yourself. That's the same. That's not going to change. But the interesting thing about chemical dependency addiction is that, number one, the consequences are extremely fucking harsh. Okay. If you get into that mode. I'm not talking about casual drug use. I'm not talking about like the fear of drugs, like all that hysterical propaganda is bullshit. It actually creates more addiction than it solves. But the other thing too is that you can live without drugs. If you can get to a point where drugs are not in your system and you don't have the physical need and you just have the emotional and mental need that pops up every once and again, that's easier to deal with than figuring out, okay, well, how do I reintroduce sex in my life? How do I start having sex healthy in my life? How do I start building that? Okay, so sexual addiction on that side of the recovery spectrum can be a little bit more complex. Different things to consider, especially when you're finding solutions. A lot of people talk about addiction and it's like, well, with alcohol addiction or chemical dependency, you abstain. And there's this bad thing and there's this thing to blame, drugs, man. I'll tell you this, in my life right now, I love drugs. I just don't use them. They're amazing. But when I do, it fucks me up, but they're beautiful things. They're just like these great things that allow you to experience all this stuff. And some can be really, really horrible at times. But again, if you're blaming, you're not going to find that solution. So one of the things that we do that's very, very big and that we really live for, this is super important for just how we communicate on our level of TSL and different men's development communities. So we build community, we explore, and then in terms of this, we be sexual. Okay, so we exist at it. Okay, we exist as who we are. So whether that's a social component, we have community, we self-explore, and then we be social. If that's working on our mind and our bodies, we have a community, we self-explore, we look at who we are and how we are and interact with the world, but then we implement and use our mind and body in the right way. Well, in this case, we be sexual, and this is really important. And our groups are very loose. One of the keys to our group is there's no judgment. Okay. There's no judgment about sexual behavior or practice. The only rules that I'd say there are is that we don't, breach confidentiality. We don't share information, what's happening, and when we do talk and when we do interact about this. And the other thing is we don't facilitate encouraging harm or illegal acts. So here's the thing, especially when we get into stuff, especially with sex, is there's a lot of people who do illegal stuff. I mean, in some states, sodomy is illegal. But other things, like people might be into some crazy stuff that are like, whoa, man, look, that's not for us to judge or even encourage, especially if it is something that is illegal. But we can listen to it and we can let that person express. And I'll tell you this, I'll get to what everybody's thinking, but basically you can do whatever you want. You can talk about whatever you want. You can fantasize whatever you want and express that. And man, let me tell you, when you take judgment out of the community of a group, some amazing stuff happens. As long as everybody there is willing to be honest and share and communicate and connect, man, I'll tell you this, if you're listening to this and you've never been a part of our courses, sadly, you probably haven't been a part of a group and a community that practices expression in that way. It's just one of the coolest things. So don't jump to extremes here. This always happens. As soon as I bring this up, questions like this come up where it's like, so wait a minute. You have groups where you allow like pedophiles to come up and talk about their experiences and you encourage them, or rapists or people who want to talk about violence against women. I'll tell you this. Number one, in the 10 years of having men's groups, that's never happened. But if it did happen and they wanted to talk about that urge, if they did have if they were a true pedophile, it's not somebody that was conditioned that way, and they weren't acting on it and weren't talking about how to act on it more, but how to process past that feeling, totally, man, or how to deal with it and manage it and have this sexual urge that is highly illegal and causes great harm to other people. And they don't want to implement that on the world. Or this is one thing that everybody has, man. Men and women both have rape fantasies. It's super common. It's so common that it's the vast majority of men and women. We're not going to let people talk about that. We're not going to let people talk about different things that happen within them. Another one that comes up in men's groups that are separate from this is people may talk about suicide. Oh my God, that person's mentally ill. This person, if somebody talks about suicide or wanting to kill somebody or wanting to hurt somebody, we have to report them. Look, if they're really going to do it, of course we don't want them to do it, but we want to offer a place where somebody can express to do that. And here's the thing that we found with it. Many people think about suicide. It's not everybody, but many people do. The majority, over 50%, do at some point. And if they can talk about it, it's like, I'm going through this mode where I'm depressed. It stops becoming a big deal and people stop reacting upon it and stop isolating upon it. Same thing goes with wanting to cause harm, inflict violence, and fight people. We don't encourage them to, but it's like, man, you can talk about it. We feel rage all the time or different things like that. You got to have a forum to be able to talk about those things and then talk to guys who've had experience. Okay. And this is the important part. What makes a good group are these qualities. Number one is we can't have judgment. If we have judgment around there, like there's a right or a wrong, no, there's your personal path to excellence. There's your personal path that you decide, that you define what that is, of what is right and wrong. And then you fit it into society and those rules. But guess what? Here's the thing, especially when you bring up tough topics like, oh my God, I'm, it could be I'm relapsing, or I went on this tear of porn or started watching stuff. And I'll tell you this, in my personal experience with sexual addiction, I watched porn the whole time. And man, I know what it's like to go on some benders. But again, that's not everybody's experience. Like you could cut that out, but I watched it the whole time. In fact, I found a great relief from guys who were who came to a peace about their sexuality, who came from the porn industry. I found great relief talking to those guys. Some still work in the porn industry. And the thing is that there was that experience. There were guys who had more experience than me, okay, in certain situations. It wasn't an experience about being better than me, but they had walked down the road further. They had gotten to a point where they had screwed up and what happened when they screwed up and how to deal with that. I needed those guys who had walked before me. I also needed the guys who were walking at the same pace as me, And so that's going to always happen. You're going to always have these three different types of people around you. Guys who are more experienced, guys who are at the same level as you, and guys who have less experience. And then I needed the guys who were new, who didn't know what to do, who were in the point of confusion about it and fresh with it, because I had forgotten what that was like. And also you got to you got to give it away to keep it. That's a super, super key part. It's what activates our empathy. It's what activates our exchange. It's just such a cool thing. And so when we truly have a community of non-judgment, man, good things happen. Change happens. Guilt, shame, things like, judgment. When that goes away, guess what happens? Expression comes up. When expression comes up, we can have true empathy. We can have true relating. When expression comes up, we can have true seduction, true communication in our pure selves, rather than it's like, oh my God, I want to fuck this girl's brains out, but that's a bad thought. I shouldn't be having that thought. Okay. Man, it's like we can get in touch with the many different variables and levels of how we think and feel and move within that. Because look, sexuality and communication is very complex. Okay. One of the things that is fundamental about us as well is exploration. All right. You have to look at yourself. You're going to have to, and this is the hardest thing. If people walk away from our programs, it's usually here, because it's like, all right, we can have this community of non-judgment. There's no authority. There's no real enforcement. And so they're like, well, wait a minute, but I want somebody to tell me what to do. I want to be told I'm fucked up. If they can get past that, and then they get to the exploration part, it's like, okay, now look at yourself. No, man, you're going to look at yourself. We'll help you through it, but examine yourself, do an inventory, look at the whys, look at the sexuality, look at what's behind that, look at the emotion, look at the physicality, look at the shame, look at the things you hate, look at where that comes from, and really, really answer and dive in deep to those things. You don't have to take our route, but that form of exploration is necessary. Why? Because when you show up intimately and connected with somebody in any situation, when your clothes are off and you're aroused, when you're in business, when you're making a friendship with somebody, man, you have to know yourself. If you're afraid of yourself and you're hiding yourself, then you're living within a reaction, and essentially you are living a lie in that communication, that bond, and you can't. Your empathy is broken, your seduction is broken, your connection is broken. Okay, so you are facilitating and maintaining disconnect while trying to have the benefits of connection. A good place to start, if you're interested in this, you can find out more about the identity workbook at TSL. It's since 2009. That's basically where we start with most people, although there are other forms of exploration. That is something that you just really have to experience us to be a part of, to know that sort of exploration, but it's there, man. It's a huge part, man. The next part is that being sexual. Well, how do we exist as this? How do we exist as our nature? How can we get back to that born to be philosophy that we have here in our different men's groups that we work off of? Well, look, sex is an expression with many things. Many times we look at sex within the boundaries of extremes, good and bad, or secrets, or shames, or wants, or desires, or all these little things, but not just as what is. So how do we do that? Like, and really look at yourself with this. Like, start to answer those questions in that exploration. It's like, how do you be sexual without having sex? How do you be sexual with your presence? How do you be sexual with you as a man? What does that mean? How do you be sexual during sex? How do you be sexual after sex? What happens with relationships? What happens with, the full expression of who I am? So a lot of times, you could talk about, but this is really dependent upon experience. I always love this because guys, if you're not sexually active, this is all theoretical and conceptual and it makes literally no sense to you, but it's like, all right, as a man, what does that mean? What does it mean for you to be the sex of a man, a male person born as a man and not as a woman, truly the sex of you? What does that mean? What characteristics come along with that? How do you be sexual with that? Now, a sexually active guy could talk a lot about that. And if we're a big group, we talk a lot about it. But if there's people who aren't sexually active, it's kind of a weird question and you don't really get it, but man, if you have been sexually active with enough dialogue, man, you can really find a lot of power in the exploration of that, and then the implementation of that, and then the being of that man at all times. Also expressing your intent. Sex and seduction is dependent upon intent, and intent actually exchanging. If you look at the actual social dynamic, you can be social all you want. You can joke about sex, whatever. It's not sexual until intent is exchanged. I want you, you want me. How do you project that intent? How do you do it so it communicates? How do you do it so you don't offend people? How do you do it so it is welcomed and seen as a good thing? That is an interesting thing. And that's what you need to look at, explore, and then practice. How do you be that? Because if you're not being that, you're not being sexual. You're living within shame or repression or some sort of cultural confusion. How do you exchange sexually? Well, how do you do that physically, emotionally, mentally? There's so many different things in this. How do you act sexually? What in the act of sex do you like? Because there's so many different variants in that, and your brain changes. It's interesting. The exchange of sexuality, the arousal process is far different than the actual state of sex. The arousal process has this push-pull back and forth thing of, all this hot and cold and liking things and easing of tension and building up tension. When you're having sex, it's smooth sailing and it's slow, this nice paced feeling. And sometimes it can be erratic and aggressive. What is the result of your sex? Relationships, who you are, how you change. There's an old concept that comes from TSL where we would say there's identity, then there's application, then there's technique. And when you do all those, it moves back into identity in this experience. But identity, who I am, the application, where the women are, how do I talk to them? How do I express, what different venues, yada, yada, yada. And then that should define the different techniques that you use. Your technique is subservient to the woman herself, the environment, your identity. And then when you experience that, and you get a result, it changes you and it changes your identity. And it moves in that range. In any case, being sexual is an action and you need to do it. It's not a concept. I'm not just talking about these as these like crazy cool things that you can think about and talk about in your men's group. I'm saying, no, we talk about them and then how can we do them? How was I this today? And that's very important. Okay. You want to get sexually healthy, whether you have a sexual dysfunction or not, it's going to come from being sexual in all of your ways. It's one of the greatest lives to live, man. It's a beautiful thing. One thing that I'll say is, look, guys, if you encounter dysfunction, it happens to all of us. It's the most normal thing in the world, okay? Don't buy into the hysteria. The best thing that you can do is if you encounter dysfunction is relax within it. Continue to have sex. For me, if I encounter it, I feel bad. I feel inadequate. I feel let down. But we have to move past that in that wisdom of going, wait a minute, is that some social shit? Is that some real stuff that I'm feeling? But how can I continue to explore what seduction is, what sex is in that moment? Dysfunction, as we talked about, is going to be a normal process of your sex life. It's a phenomenon that will happen. It's a good thing. It means you're active. It means that things are happening. And the best thing that we can do is relax about it. We will get hurt. In our sex life, we will go through breakups. We will go through bad sex. But that's not an excuse for hating, blaming people, or thinking that we need to find something outside of ourselves to fix us. Really, when it comes down to it, is the best things that we can do is explore, learn to find our new expression, put that out there in the world, and really get some real feedback for it. And one thing that is super, super helpful with that is a community, much like we have here, and that's what we do. Community of openness, non-judgment, and the unifying desire and result of your personal excellence. All right. Hope you liked all that stuff. Leave any comments. Email me, Steve@thesexuallife, if you have any questions. And man, good stuff. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.